When I opened my eyes, the first thing I felt was the heat.
It wasn't the heat of a modern city, nor the dry heat of a desert I knew from photographs.
It was a heavy, living heat, mixed with the smell of sand, smoke, burnt wood, and river water.
My name is Lara. I was 34 years old when it happened. In that instant, I was standing before one of the most fascinating civilizations in human history.
Egypt. But not the Egypt of museums, not the Egypt of textbooks.
I was in the Egypt of approximately 2400 BC.
Men walked by carrying baskets. Before me, the world we know as ancient Egypt was still alive. Children ran among animals. Boats sailed slowly along the Nile. In the distance, monumental structures rose against the sky.
And then I realized something. I was looking at a world that would completely disappear thousands of years later.
But at that moment, no one there knew that.
To those people, that wasn't history. It was simply life.
I started walking.
And the further I went, the more I realized that almost everything I imagined about ancient Egypt was incomplete.
Today, we think of it as a river surrounded by ruins and tourist monuments. But in 2400 BC, it was much more than a river.
It was the reason that society existed.
The Nile was a road, a source of food.
Upkend, a transport system, a border, a calendar, and a spiritual center.
The first surprise was the Nile itself. Everything depended on it.
The crops were close to the fertile areas left by the floods. Cities grew around that strip of life, crossing a landscape dominated by the desert.
I stood still, watching a vessel pass by.
One of them looked at me.
For a few seconds, our eyes met. Boats transported people, stones, food, and goods. He had no idea I came from thousands of years in the future.
And I had no idea how to explain to someone from that era that one day their world would be studied by millions of people.
Stay with me, because what I discovered that day about the daily life of the Egyptians
was very different from the perfect and silent image we usually see in documentaries.
I needed to understand where I was, and especially at what moment in history I had arrived. In the distance, massive constructions dominated the landscape. The pyramids. But there was something different about them. They didn't look exactly like in modern photographs. The original surface was coated with carefully worked stones,
creating a much smoother and shinier appearance.
The sunlight reflected off the structures. For a moment, I was speechless. Today, when we see a pyramid, we usually see its exposed stone, worn down by time.
But back then, the appearance was different.
It was monumental. It was intentional. It was a declaration of power. I walked towards the area where workers and artisans carried out different activities. It began to seem much too simplistic compared to what I was seeing. There was organization. There were teams. There were specialized workers. There were people transporting materials, preparing food, making tools, and coordinating tasks. It required planning, mathematical knowledge, engineering,
Logistics, administration, and an impressive amount of human labor.
I watched men preparing stones. Some worked with copper and stone tools. Others measured surfaces. A group transported materials. Further ahead, workers received food, bread, beer, vegetables, fish.
There was a complex society behind that monument.
And that's when I realized something that gave me chills.
The pyramid wasn't just a construction. It was the center of an idea.
To understand Egypt, I would need to understand death.
Sir. The Egyptians didn't see death simply as the end.
Death was a transition, a passage to another existence. And that explained a huge part of what I was seeing.
Tombs, statues, paintings, objects, texts, rituals. Everything was related to the preservation of identity. I walked to a funerary area.
There, the silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was respect.
Offerings were prepared. I watched a family gathered together. People worked around graves. Priests performed ceremonies.
I didn't know who had died, but I could see that the person remained present in the lives of those left behind.
There was food, objects, words, memories.
It was in that moment I understood something.
The Egyptians didn't build tombs just for the dead.
They built a bridge between the dead and the living.
That idea would completely change the way I viewed that civilization.
But there was something even more interesting. Writing.
Hieroglyphs weren't just decorative drawings. They could represent sounds, words, and concepts.
And scribes were extremely important. I found one of them working.
He was sitting with a careful posture, holding his instrument and recording information.
It seemed almost mundane. But I knew I was observing one of the most powerful technologies of that world.
The ability to transform memory into a record. Thanks to people like him, thousands of years later, we could still know names, taxes, offerings, events, and beliefs of that society.
I thought about how many stories might have been recorded on that sheet.
The scribe looked up. He observed me for a few seconds. Then he went back to work. How many lives had passed through those hands? How many names would survive? And how many would disappear forever?
Maybe that's one of the most fascinating parts of ancient Egypt. We know some pharaohs. We know monuments. We know gods. And yet, they were there, building, planting, cooking, loving, raising children, arguing, laughing, fearing, living. If you like stories told as if we were walking inside the past, leave a comment telling me which civilization you'd like me to visit next. Rome? Greece?
I continued my walk. That's when I found a market. There, Egypt looked completely different.
There were no supermarkets. There was no modern refrigeration. There were no machines capable of transporting tons of products in a few hours.
A part of the population worked directly in agriculture. Others were soldiers. There were priests, administrators, scribes, merchants, specialized workers. Another part produced tools. Some were artisans. At the top was the pharaoh, considered a figure of enormous political and religious importance. But below him existed a complex administrative structure. The state needed to control lands, collect taxes, distribute resources, organize construction, maintain temples, manage workers. All of this required bureaucracy, and bureaucracy required records.
That's when I realized that ancient Egypt was much closer to a massive administrative machine than I had imagined.
The pharaoh couldn't control everything alone. There were officials, governors, scribes, priests, overseers, and a huge network of people that kept the system running.
Instruments were being played. People sang. Movements were performed in an organized way. Religion was present in practically every aspect of life.
Gods represented forces of nature, aspects of society, and fundamental principles of existence. And the Egyptians didn't view the world just as matter. There was a cosmic order, a principle known as ma'at. The idea involved balance, truth, justice, and order. And that was much deeper than simply obeying rules. Society believed that the universe needed to remain in balance. The pharaoh played an important role in maintaining it. The rituals weren't just demonstrations of faith. They were part of the structure that, in the Egyptian view, kept the world running.
I imagined what it would be like to wake up every day believing that your actions didn't just affect my own life. But perhaps the biggest surprise was yet to come. I wanted to discover how common people lived inside their homes. I followed a path into a residential area.